There's a town in Maryland called Frederick. Pretty place, Civil War history, couple of breweries, sort of high street that turns up in regional tourism adverts. And on the edge of it, behind a fence most people drive past without a second look, sits what might be the single most important address in the history of American biological secrecy. You have probably never heard of it, and that is more or less the point. Unless you've watched this channel, you might know about it. But because this is one place that keeps coming back over and over again across 80 years and about 6 completely separate scandals. It's like a stain that won't wash out of the carpet no matter what you do. A secret germ weapons program, exposure experiments on its own soldiers, live bacteria sprayed over American cities while people went to work. A government scientist who left a hotel room through a 13th floor window. The worst bioterror attack in American history, traced back to a flask hidden inside its own walls. A safety shutdown the public learned about from the newspapers, and then, decades later, a conspiracy theory about a pandemic broadcast around the planet by foreign governments. Most of these stories you were only allowed to know about years later, some of them decades later. A couple of them only came out because somebody dug up a body, or filed a lawsuit, or sat in front of a Senate committee and finally said the quiet part into a microphone. So the obvious question is the wrong one. The wrong question is whether this place is evil. The right question, though, is quieter and honestly a bit worse. Why does the truth about Fort Detrick always seem to show up too late to do anything about it? Before it was a cancer research site, before it got dragged into a pandemic it actually had nothing to do with, before any of the cover stories, it was built for just one job: to take living things and turn them into weapons. This is the story of how that job never really ended. It just kept changing its name, and every time it changed its name, somebody decided, you can find out about it later. Maybe, if ever. And stay with me, because the pattern matters more than any single horror in it. We are going to start at the fence in 1943. And by the end, you're going to understand why a perfectly ordinary town in Maryland became the place American secrets go to rot. It started, like a lot of these things start, with a memo and a fear. 1941, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, asks the National Academy of Science a simple question. Could an enemy attack the United States with disease? Could you actually do that? Well, the scientists came back and say, in effect, well, yeah, probably it might work. That's all it took. Once a respectable institution tells the government a weapon is feasible, the government is going to bloody well build it, every time. They are constitutionally somehow incapable of leaving that box shut. So in 1942, Roosevelt quietly authorizes a civilian-run effort, and they give it a name so boring your eyes slide right off of it: the War Research Service. And the man they put in charge, well, this is where it gets a bit strange. His name is George Merck, as in the pharmaceutical company, the same industry whose entire public story is curing you, was at the top, helping to run America's effort to grow things that would, well, frankly do the opposite. Well, you see, they needed somewhere to actually do the work, and it needed to be somewhere with space, somewhere close enough to Washington that the generals could keep an eye on it, but far enough out that nobody would ask what that smell was. And they found a sleepy little airfield outside Frederick. Detrick Field. National Guard had used it. Mostly, it just sat there. On the 9th of March 1943, it stopped being an airfield. It became Camp Detrick, home of the US Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. The whole conversion cost about $1.25 million, which even in 1943 money is a rounding error for what they were actually building. The first scientific director was a bacteriology professor from Wisconsin named Ira Baldwin. And Baldwin understood exactly what he signed up for, which is actually what makes him interesting. He insisted on staying a civilian. His line about it was, as long as I wore a red tie, I could say no to anybody. He also left behind the single most quietly terrifying sentence in the foundation of the place. He told the brass, if you could do it in a test tube, well, you could probably do it in a 10,000-gallon tank. Yeah, that's one for you. He's not talking about beer. He's talking about anthrax. And they did. They built it at scale and they built it fast. Construction starts in the spring of 43. By the end of the war, the place is holding something like 1,700 army personnel, plus naval officers, plus civilians, spread across more than 200 buildings. At the center of it all is a hangar, 50,000 square feet. Inside an anthrax plant and a botulinum toxin plant built around a 10,000 gallon fermenter and a pair of smaller ones. Baldwin's test tube, made real, made enormous. They picked anthrax first for a cold, practical reason. The spores are tough. You can dry them, store them, drop them, and they survive. A bacterium that politely dies on the way to the target, well, that's no use for anyone. Anthrax doesn't do that. It does you a favor. Now, the version of this story where America invents germ warfare in a shed is completely wrong. This was a joint effort, British, Canadian, American. And the British were, if anything, further down the road and considerably more willing to actually pull the trigger. Off the coast of Scotland, there's a small island called Grunard. In 1942, British scientists from Portendown took anthrax bombs out there and tested them on a flock of sheep. That's quite possibly the most British thing I've ever heard, to be fair. Well, the sheep died, as you might expect, which was rather the point. The plan it was feeding, and I promise I'm not making this up, was called Operation Vegetarian. The idea was to drop anthrax-laced cattle cakes onto German farmland and basically collapse their food supply. It worked a little bit too well. Grunard Island stayed contaminated and sealed off for about 48 years. Half a century. They finally doused it with formaldehyde and seawater in the 80s and then declared it safe in 1990. An island quarantined for 2 human generations because of that test. And in March 1994, Churchill put in an order. 500,000 anthrax bombs from the Americans. Camp Detrick produced its first batch of 5,000 that May. So that's the first thing to make a note of. Before a single American city was ever sprayed, before any of the experiments we're going to get to, the place was already an industrial weapons factory, building bombs to spread diseases on behalf of the most senior people in 2 governments. None of that is contested, by the way. None of it is conspiracy. It's history. Documented history that just they forgot to put on the tourist board, I guess. Anywho's, after the war, it grew. Over the life of the program, they weaponized and stockpiled 7 different agents: anthrax, tularemia, brucellosis, Q fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, botulinum toxin, and staph. And I think after pronouncing all of that in one take, I deserve a like. If you could drop me one, come on guys, that'd be huge, thank you. The other one was enterotoxin B, or it was staph enterotoxin B, sorry. They worked on crop killers too, and the idea there, coming back to the idea of starve the enemy out rather than infect them. And they divided the labor the way you would run any industry. Fort Detrick was the brains, the research. Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas did the mass production. And the wide open desert in Dugway in Utah, that's where you took it outside to see how it actually spread. But here's the question that makes biological weapons different from every other kind. Why bother? You've already got high explosives. You've got the late 40s, you've got the atomic bomb. Why crawl around with germs and bacteria? And the answer is the genuinely sinister part. A germ doesn't announce itself. A bomb leaves a crater with your name on it. A disease just looks like bad luck. People get sick, people die. Nobody can prove it was you. The horror was not only that it could kill, it was that it could kill while you stood there looking innocent. To study exactly how these invisible weapons moved through the air, in 1949 they built something that still sounds like a Bond villain's idea of a paperweight. A hollow steel sphere, 40 feet across, a 1-inch steel hull weighing 131 tons. They called it the 8-ball. You could pump up aerosol of a live agent inside it and measure how it dispersed. It is now, and I want to really make this point, on the National Register of Historic Places. A 1 million litre chamber for testing germs is now officially historic. But A weapon you can't see has one enormous problem for the people building it. At some point, to know if it works, you have to know how it moves through a real living human body, which means eventually you need people. Make a note of that one, because the way they solved that problem, this is where Fort Detrick stops being a factory and starts being something you're gonna have a much harder time forgiving. I wanna be fair to this place, at least, because the easy version of this story is a lie, and well, you deserve the hard one. When the army needed human data, it did not, in this instance, go grabbing people off of the street. It went looking for volunteers, and it found a very specific kind. Seventh-day Adventists, conscientious objectors, young men whose faith meant they wouldn't carry a rifle, but they still wanted to serve. The army offered them a deal. Hey guys, you won't have to fight, you don't have to do the violence and the shooty and all of that. Just, let us study what these agents do to a human being instead. They called this Operation Whitecoat. From 1954 to 1973, more than 2,300 of them took that deal. 151 studies over 19 years. And by the standards of Cold War human experimentation, which is admittedly a rather low bar to clear, Whitecoat was almost decent. The men were briefed, they signed consent forms, they could say no, and about 1 in 5 did. They could pull out partway through, and nobody died during the testing. Well done, top marks. They were exposed to things like Q fever and tularemia, sometimes piped into that 40-foot steel sphere, sometimes out in the Utah desert in the summer of '55. Then they were treated, and the data those men gave up their health for fed into real vaccines. Q fever, tularemia, yellow fever, hepatitis A, Rift Valley fever. People are alive today because of what was learned from their bodies. So, no cartoon villainy. This is the part of Fort Detrick that genuinely tried to behave. Oh, but then you look at the footnotes. When it was over, the army went back and checked on about 500 of the more than 2,000 men. Less than a quarter of them. They declined to fund the blood test that would have told anyone what the long-term cost was. So we don't actually know. The men signed up understanding the short-term risk. The institution simply chose not to find out what happened to them later down the line and then just closed the file and washed their hands of it. And let me remind you, that is the better behaved version. And hold on to this for what comes next, because it does not get better. The contrast of this, that is the whole point. Whitecoat at least had consent forms. San Francisco most definitely did not. In 1977, in a Senate hearing room, the United States Army admitted something out loud that sounds like it has to have been invented or made up. Between 1949 and 1969, it had conducted 239 open-air tests, spraying things into the air over American places. 80 of those used live bacteria that, at the time, the army had decided was harmless. Not over deserts, not over ranges, no, over populated cities, over people, over you, if you happen to be standing in the wrong place on the wrong morning, breathing like people do. The clearest example has a name that sounds almost gentle. Operation Sea Spray. September 1950, a US Navy ship sets off the coast of San Francisco and sprays a cloud of bacteria toward the city. Oh boy, here's another pronunciation blunder. Serratia mascescens. Mostly. Close enough. The army's own calculations afterward was that nearly every one of the city's roughly 800,000 residents inhaled some of it. Effectively, the entire population was dosed without a word. Now, they picked Serratia partly because it grows in a bright red color, which made it really easy to track where the cloud went. And they believed it was safe. Then in the weeks after, 11 people turned up at Stanford Hospital with a rare urinary infection. Serratia, the same bug. One of them was 75 years old and he was named Edward Nevin, recovering from a prostate surgery, and he died. Now, I have to be careful here because being careful is important, but was the spraying definitively what killed Edwin Nevin? Well, we can't say for certain. All 11 patients had had medical procedures. The outbreak stayed inside that one hospital, which is not what you would expect from a citywide cloud. The army leaned hard on this exactly those points. So the honest grade is contested. A documented spraying, a documented death, and a causal link that has never quite been nailed down. The Nevin family sued. They lost. The court ruled the government was immune. Convenient. The link was unproven. Convenient. And the Supreme Court declined to even hear it. Which tells you how this tends to go. Even when a citizen ends up dead and the government admits it released bacteria over them, you can do absolutely nothing about it. And San Francisco was not a one-off. This turned out to be a program. 1966, New York City operatives from Detrick Special Operations Division walked into the subway with light bulbs filled with bacteria and dropped them onto the tracks as trains came through. The trains acted like pistons and pushed the cloud for miles through all of the tunnels, through all of the stations, through all of the commuters. The Army's conclusion in the report was that the subway was a ripe target for a covert biological attack. We only know about it because a Defense Department report surfaced in 1980, 14 years later. 1965, Washington National Airport and Greyhound Bus Terminal. Agents released bacteria from spray generators hidden inside briefcases. Travelers, families, everyone just walking through. Oh, and that brings us to the insects, which is where my ability to stay composed may start to wobble slightly. They ran tests dropping uninfected mosquitoes and fleas to see how they would disperse as a dry run for one day dropping infected ones. In 1955, over Savannah, Georgia, they released more than 300,000 mosquitoes. Some of it went over a neighborhood called Carver Village, a predominantly black neighborhood. Residents reported swarms and illness and were not told why. And before the mosquitoes, fucking fleas. Operation Big Itch. Yeah, I know, you can't make it up. 1954, they packed uninfected fleas into cluster munitions and dropped them at Dugway to see if the things would survive the fall and spread out looking for something to bite. The fleas survived just fine, thank you very much. They spread out exactly as hoped and then bit the living crap out of the aircrew and the test staff because a flea did not read the mission briefing. The experiment worked. That was actually the problem. It worked. They gave these things names like Big Buzz and Dropkick and Mayday, running them over real towns through the 50s. The plan underneath all of that was the same. Prove you could deliver disease on the backs of insects so that one day you could do it for real. There is a document from Dugway from 1981 that worked out the economics of all of this, the cost per death of an insect-borne biological attack. So they priced a human life as a delivery problem at 29 cents. So let me put the question the way the blueprint of this whole thing demands. If all of this was harmless, as they keep insisting it was, why did it take decades and Senate hearings and lawsuits and leaked reports for you to hear anything about any of it? The question, by the way, is about to get a lot more personal, because the next people the system failed to protect weren't strangers in the subway. They were actually the men who worked inside the fence. Working with these agents was dangerous enough in the obvious way. People got infected. The Army's own count over the offensive years was about 456 occupational infections. I mean, most people recovered, 3 didn't. The first was a microbiologist called William Boyle, 46 years old. In November 1951, he breathed in anthrax inside the lab he worked in, and it killed him. I guess that's the epitome of fuck around and find out. And this is the detail I cannot let go. His death certificate didn't say anthrax, it said bronchial pneumonia. The cause of death of a man killed by a secret weapon his government was building was quietly written down as something else. A lie in ink on a legal document for the family to keep. That fact was only admitted in 1975, 24 years his death had sat there mislabeled. They later named streets on the base after the men who died, which is a strange kind of honor when you falsified how one of them died for 25 years. There were others. Joe Willard, an electrician, 53, killed by inhaled anthrax in 1958. Albert Nickel, an animal caretaker, also 53, killed in 1964 by a hemorrhagic fever virus after an animal bite. These are ordinary working men. They're not soldiers, they're not volunteers signing any forms. It's a sparky and an animal handler who went to work at a strange government facility and didn't come home. And there's one more thing the record shows, and I'd rather it didn't. When workers like Boyle were infected, the program harvested anthrax from their bodies, from the blood and the organs of its own dead and dying staff. Because the strain that had been deadly enough to kill a healthy man was, by definition, exactly the strain they wanted for the weapon. The men weren't only victims of the program, they became the raw materials for it. Quick thing, because I like to label myths on this channel. There is a tower on that base, Building 470, that the anthrax was once piloted in. Local legend says people died inside it, that it's cursed, the works. As far as the document records go, that part isn't true. Nobody is recorded as having died in the tower. I mention it because you don't need the legend. The real deaths, the real men, the real falsified certificates and all that, they are way worse than any myth or ghost story. They actually happened. So the pattern is the same on the inside as the outside. Harm first, truth maybe much later. But the most famous death connected to Fort Detrick wasn't anthrax. It didn't happen in the lab. It happened 9 floors up in a hotel in New York in the dark. And people are still arguing about what it was. Frank Olson was a bacteriologist. He worked in Detrick's Special Operations Division, the unit that handled the cloak and dagger stuff and the end of the science. His specialty was the airborne dispersal of biological agents, knowing how to make these things spread through the air over people. And he was good at it. And that expertise made his unit useful to a customer outside of the army, the CIA, under a program called MK Naomi, sitting inside the broader and much more infamous MK Ultra, run by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. The agency borrowed Detrick's know-how. In November 1953, a small group of these men went to a retreat at a place called Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. The cover story, written down, was that they were at a meeting of scriptwriters and editors. Yeah, they were not. After dinner, Gottlieb's people poured the group an after-dinner drink, a liqueur, and without telling them, well, they'd laced it all with LSD. They wanted to see what the drug did to unwitting people, so they dosed their own colleagues at a work retreat and then sat back and took notes. Frank Olson did not come down well. He became agitated, paranoid, and in the days after he told people he wanted to resign, that something was deeply wrong. The agency's response was to take him to New York, supposedly for psychiatric help, to a doctor who happened to have his own history with LSD. In the early hours of the 28th of November 1953, Frank Olson went out of the window of room 1018A of the Hotel Statler, 13 floors. A CIA man, Robert Lashbrook, was in the room with him. With the official verdict, suicide. A troubled scientist, a tragic fall, case closed. Only Frank Olson's wife and children were told he'd jumped. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about the retreats. They were not told any of the true context of the last week of his life. They simply buried him and left them to wonder what had broken him. And they wondered for 22 years. In 1975, the lid comes off the CIA. The Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee start dragging the agency's secret history into daylight, And buried in it is a line about an army scientist who'd been given LSD without his knowledge and then fell to his death. The Olson family reads it in the paper. That is how they find out. Not from a knock at the door, from the news. To his credit, President Ford brought the family into the Oval Office and apologized to their faces. Congress passed a bill paying them $750,000. An admission of a kind. The government had drugged a man and then lied to his widow about how he died. That much is documented, it is settled, it is not disputed. And it would already be one of the worst things in this entire story. But Frank Olson's son, Eric, never accepted that his father simply jumped. And in 1994, he did something most grieving children never could. He had his father exhumed and re-examined. The forensic scientist who led it, James Starr, found things that troubled him. A hematoma on the skull, an injury to the chest he didn't think fit a man going through a window. His phrase was that the findings were, his words, rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. A Manhattan DA opened a murder investigation in 1996 and couldn't find enough to charge anyone. The family sued the CIA in 2012 and the case was thrown out, partly because of that 1976 payout, but even the judge who dismissed it wrote that the public record supported many of the family's allegations, as far-fetched as they sounded. Here's where I need to plant a flag and then move on. Was Frank Olson murdered? I don't know. Nobody can prove it. That stays contested. But there is a document that makes it impossible to be comfortable. A CIA assassination manual from the 1950s advised that the most efficient accident for a simple killing is a fall from a 75 feet place or higher up, preferably onto a hard surface. And it added that it would usually be necessary to stun or drug the subject first. I am not telling you that's what happened to Frank Olson. I'm just telling you that the agency that drugged him wrote down in its own training manual that drugging a man and dropping him out of a window is how you make a murder look like a suicide. You can decide for yourself how that sits. And it raises the real question hanging over this whole chapter. Detrick wasn't only a military lab building weapons for a battlefield, it had a second customer in the shadows who wasn't thinking about battlefields at all. So what exactly was that customer trying to build? I will keep this part tight because it would be really easy to get lost in spy gadgets and toy box stuff and miss out on what matters. Maybe I'll do that in another video. The deal between the CIA and Detrick's Special Operations Division went all the way back to 1952. And it produced exactly what you'd expect once you let an intelligence agency loose in a biological weapons lab. Not battlefield bombs, personal ones. They built tiny dart guns, a pistol that fired a tiny frozen dart, almost silent, that could put poison into a person, leave a wound so small a coroner would likely miss it. The agent inside was shellfish toxin, saxitoxin. It stops the body fast, and to a doctor it can look like a heart attack. They had poison pens, poison pills, a whole quiet catalogue for killing a single human being and leaving no fingerprints on the cause of death. Like LSD in a hotel room? Anyway, that is the point of mentioning it at all. The science that started as how do we defend against an enemy army had crossed into a line of how do we kill one specific man in his flat and have it ruled as natural causes. Same building, same expertise, completely different purposes. And then, on the 25th of November, 1969, something genuinely remarkable happened. The President of the United States stood at Fort Detrick, the germ factory itself, and announced he was shutting the offensive program down. All of it, unilaterally. No treaty forcing his hand, just a decision. Nixon's words were sober and, to my surprise, completely correct. Biological weapons, he said, have massive, unpredictable, and potentially uncontrollable consequences. They may produce global epidemics. They may harm the health of future generations. I spend a lot of these videos describing governments doing the wrong thing. So let me be straight with this one when, surprisingly, one does the right thing. this was real. The order went out. The stockpiles built up over a quarter of a century were actually destroyed, agent by agent, into 1972 and beyond. It opened the door to Biological Weapons Convention, the first treaty in history to ban an entire category of weapons outright. For one moment in this whole story, the danger genuinely receded. For one moment, because here is what the destruction order ran into. After the ban, the CIA was told to destroy its share of the poisons too. And a CIA chemist named Nathan Gordon, well, he just didn't. He kept roughly 11 grams of that shellfish toxin in storage, enough by the estimates for thousands of lethal doses. He kept the cobra venom as well, a direct presidential order to destroy the deadliest assassination material in the inventory, and someone simply put it in the cupboard and carried on. It only came out in 1975 when the CIA director William Colby walked into a Senate hearing and produced the dart gun in front of the cameras. The president had banned it. The agency had quietly kept it anyway. And that is the truth that should sit underneath the rest of this. The ban was sincere to the top. It just didn't reach all the way down. The Soviet Union, for its part, signed the treaty and then ran an enormous secret biological program for another 20 years in flat violation of it. So what actually changed at Fort Detrick? The offensive weapons were gone, for real. But the labs were still there. The expertise was still there. The deadly organisms, kept now for study instead of weapons, were still there. The secrecy was still there, and the public's reasons not to trust the place, they were very much still there. The old offensive labs got a new name. The US Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USA MRID. Its mission now was defense, protecting soldiers and civilians against exactly the kind of weapons the place was used to building. Nixon talked about turning swords into plowshares, and a cancer research lab even moved onto the site to prove the point. Weapon became defense, factory became research. Same fence, new sign. Which leaves one genuinely hard question, and it's the one the rest of this story turns on. What does a germ warfare laboratory actually become after germ warfare has been banned? Does the danger leave with the weapons, or does it just go quiet and wait? The defensive era wasn't a quiet retirement. To defend against the worst diseases on Earth, you have to keep the worst diseases on Earth in your building and work with them. USA MRAD ran the high containment labs, the spacesuit work, Ebola, Marburg, the things that liquefy you from the inside out. They even had a sealed clinical unit for staff who might get exposed. The official name doesn't matter, but everyone called it the Slammer. And in 1989, that quiet defensive mission walked straight into a nightmare. In a quarantine facility in Reston, Virginia, a suburb basically next door to Washington, imported monkeys started dying. A young USA MRAD scientist named Thomas Geisberg and a virologist named Peter Jarling looked at the samples and found a filovirus. Ebola. The strain they feared had something like a 90% kill rate in humans. An Ebola outbreak in a building in a Washington suburb surrounded by ordinary houses. So USA MRID ran a covert operation in plain sight. A team went in and euthanized about 450 monkeys to stop it spreading. The soldiers wore civilian clothes, deliberately, so that neighbors wouldn't panic at the sight of the military clearing out a building down the road. And it nearly went much worse before they understood it. Early on, Jarling and a colleague did something you're absolutely not supposed to do with a possible filovirus. They got a whiff of a flask of the stuff. They sniffed it. Basically the way you might check if the milk's off. Geisbert, the young one, had been handling samples that, if this had been classic Ebola, could have killed him. For days, they didn't know if they had infected themselves. They worked the problem anyway in the building while quietly wondering if they were already dead men. Well, they got lucky in the end. It turned out to be a new strain now called Reston Ebola virus that kills monkeys, but for some reason nobody fully understands, leaves us human beings alone. 6 handlers were infected, but none of them got sick. The whole thing became a best-selling book, The Hot Zone, and most people read it as a thriller with a happy ending. I would ask you to read it somewhat differently. The system worked this time, but the point that should make you uneasy is the shape of it. A catastrophe got within a mile of a daycare, and the public safety depended entirely on a secretive military lab handling it quietly and hoping that their luck held. Defense is real. Defense is necessary. It also keeps you permanently dependent on institutions that decide what you get to know and when. And then, 12 years later, that luck ran out. The exact thing Fort Detrick was built to understand arrived in the one place nobody was guarding. 1 week after the 11th of September, with the country already in shock, letters began arriving at newsrooms and Senate offices. Inside of them was a fine powder. Anthrax. The same agent Camp Detrick had been built around in 1943, now sealed in envelopes and dropped into American mailboxes. 5 people died. A photo editor in Florida named Robert Stevens, the first to fall. 2 postal workers in Washington who handled the mail that they had no reason to fear. A hospital worker in New York, and a 94-year-old woman in Connecticut with no connection to any of it, who simply received a piece of cross-contaminated mail and died anyway. 17 more were sickened. It remains the worst biological attack in American history. The investigation, codenamed Amerithrax, became one of the largest the FBI has ever run. 600,000 investigator hours, more than 10,000 interviews. And from very early, the spores themselves were pointing somewhere specific, somewhere the FBI really didn't want them to point. Their first target was a former US MRID researcher named Stephen Hatfill. The Attorney General went on television and called him a person of interest. The press camped on his lawn, and he had done nothing. Hatfill was never charged, was formally cleared, and sued the government for destroying his life. He won. Nearly $6 million, actually. The first major suspect in the case was an innocent man that the government publicly burned. A little bit irresponsible of them, that. Then the FBI turned to a man named Bruce Ivans, an anthrax vaccine scientist who had been at US MRID for 18 years. And the genetics tied the attack powder to a single source. A flask in Ivan's own lab with a codename RMR 1029, described as the purest, most concentrated batch of those particular anthrax spores known to exist. And Ivan was its custodian. In July 2008, with prosecution closing in, Bruce Ivans took an overdose and died. He never stood trial, and just over a week later, the Department of Justice named him the sole culprit. They closed the case formally in 2010 with a report built on his odd late-night hours in the lab, his documented mental health struggles, and some genuinely strange personal obsessions. And if I stopped there, you close this video thinking, you know what, fair enough, they got him. But I'm not going to stop there, because the case has a problem, and the problem is the science. In 2011, the National Academy of Science reviewed the FBI's genetic evidence, and their finding, in very careful committee language, was devastating. The analysis was consistent with the spores coming from that flask, but they did not, the panel said, definitively demonstrate it. The vice chair put it plainly: one cannot arrive at a definitive conclusion about where that anthrax came from. And it got worse for the official story. The flask had been accessed by a lot of people. By the FBI's own count, more than 400 people at Fort Detrick and other labs could have reached that material. Each investigated, each cleared, leaving just Ivans. And one of his own US MRID colleagues, a scientist named Henry Hine, told the review committee that making the quantity of anthrax in those letters in that lab without anyone noticing was just simply impossible. He said it would have taken at least a year of intensive work. He said of the senior scientists that no one believes it. So where does all of that leave us? Well, the well-documented facts are these. The anthrax was a particular strain. It was genetically linked to a flask Bruce Ivans looked after. 5 people are dead, but whether Bruce Ivans personally grew it, dried it, and posted it alone before killing himself is not proven. It is, in fact, very much contested. Senators called for a full commission to reopen it, but they never got one. And that unfinished feeling matters more than it looks, because once a government investigation ends with the public not quite believing the answer, you've created an empty space, a space where the truth used to go, and nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody is always willing to fill it. Which brings us, finally, to the present, and to the lie that wears this entire history like a costume. In the summer of 2019, the CDC effectively shut Fort Detrick's flagship lab down. It sounds enormous, and the conspiracy industry has feasted on it, so let me tell you exactly what it was, because the boring truth is important. A flood back in 2018 had knocked out the plant that sterilized the lab's wastewater, the system that makes sure nothing dangerous leaves the building through the drains. They hadn't properly fixed it. There were procedural breaches in containment, so the CDC pulled their permit to work with the deadliest agents until they sorted it out. Sounds fair enough to me. It was a safety failure, a plumbing and procedure failure at the highest stakes lab in the country, which is bad enough on its own terms. And true to form, the way the public found out was a problem. The army didn't exactly broadcast it. One US senator complained he learned his state's most dangerous lab had been shut down from reading the news. The lab was partly back by November and fully cleared in March 2020. Look at that date, March 2020, and you can already feel the trap closing. A secretive military germ lab with a real history of cover-ups gets shut down for a safety breach a few months before a pandemic starts. If you wanted to design bait for a conspiracy theory, you could not do better than that. So we all took it, naturally. Starting in 2020, Chinese state officials and state media began pushing a claim that COVID-19 hadn't come from China. No, not at all. It had escaped from Fort Detrick. They pointed at the 2019 shutdown as their smoking gun. So I'm going to be completely flat about this because it does matter. There is no credible evidence, allegedly, for that claim. None. The 2019 shutdown was about wastewater and paperwork, not a pathogen escaping. Investigators found no infectious agents outside of the areas where they belonged. It is, by every serious account, a deliberate disinformation campaign. Researchers tracking it documented more than 1,000 state-linked posts and articles in a matter of months, all engineered to flood the gap where reliable information should be. We've seen this exact thing before as well. In the 1980s, the Soviet KGB ran an operation that we now know as Operation Infekton to convince the world that HIV, the virus behind AIDS, had been engineered as a weapon. Also at Fort Detrick. Same lab, same lie. Different decade, but it was false then as well. The COVID version is false now. But here's the genuinely uncomfortable part for you, and it's the reason that this chapter exists at all, is the lie works because all of the other history is true. If Fort Detrick had a clean record, nobody would believe any of this. You can't sell a Fort Detrick conspiracy about, like a town hall, but you can sell it about a place that's been documented spraying San Francisco and falsifying details about a man's death certificate, drugging its own scientists, and got linked to the worst bioterror attack in the country's history. The decades of real secrecy are the fuel. Every genuine cover-up made the next fake one easier to believe. And that's the trap. And the people who built the secrecy built the trap, not the people who later fell for it. So, 80 years, one fence outside one ordinary town in Maryland. A weapons factory, then a place that tested those weapons on its own soldiers, and on cities full of citizens who never agreed to it. Then a covert lab with an assassination toolkit. Then, after a real and sincere ban, a defensive institute. Then the scene of a domestic terror attack it could never quite explain. And finally, a stage prop in someone else's lie. The thing I keep coming back to is that the machine never actually died, it just got caught again and again and again, and every single time, instead of ending it, it just changed its name, replaced the sign on the fence, and carried on. Weapon became defense, the experiment became data, exposure became preparedness, and secrecy, the thing underneath all of it, became national security. Same work, same building, just a cleaner word on the door each time. And the worst of the damage isn't the biological stuff. The anthrax all got destroyed. The 8-ball is a historic monument now. The real contamination is the one nobody decontaminated. It's trust. Because every story in this video has the same shape. The harm came first. The truth came later. Sometimes 20 years later from a Senate hearing. Sometimes from a son exhuming his own father. Sometimes never, not really. And a country cannot keep asking its people to trust secret science and then only confirm the truth once the victims are dead. The documents are yellow and the men responsible are safely retired. Do that for long enough and you don't just lose an argument. You lose the public's ability to tell the difference between what's real and what's a rumor. You are teaching them that the official story is the one thing you can be sure is incomplete. William Boyle breathed in anthrax in 1951. The men who ran his lab wrote pneumonia on the certificate and let his family believe it for 24 years. That is the whole story of Fort Detrick in one death. They always meant to tell the truth.